Shabbat Shalom. In today's Torah portion, the name given to it actually comes from the Haftarah. And the word is Nachamu, which means comforter, comfort. And I'm not going to get into the verses, but through this journey that I went through, God did comfort me, but in a way that was unexpected. Not with the typical comfort, like a warm hug, but with the answer, with the choice. So before I begin, let me talk about some background. Now, when my dad was around 20s, he was invited to a Messianic synagogue, and he just really felt like that was his calling, that was his joy, and this was what he was supposed to do. Now, my mom, she married into it, so this is going to be a part of her life anyway, so. Now, for me and my siblings, though, we grew up in this, and there were definitely many challenges and things that we had to go through, and we all have our own story of how we went about the struggle. And I was kind of reminded where last time I was up here saying the blessings, I actually did the portion for my sister for her bat mitzvah, and this is actually the portion for my brother. And I was kind of just reminded by, in this struggle that I felt alone, but I had siblings that I could have talked to, probably save myself from all those struggles. But honestly, God used all those struggles for his good. So now a little bit more about my upbringing. I went to a Jewish preschool, and then I went to a Hebrew school from ages 6 to 12. So once a week, then came into twice a week. Then I went to a Christian school for a couple years, and then went to a Baptist school for 10 years of my life. So you could see a mix of all these different faith communities, and I would be lying if I said it wasn't a bit confusing and challenging to go through it. And I was thinking, if you just saw me walking across the street, you'll be like, this guy looks Indian. But I did not feel that one bit. Interesting enough, Indian jokes actually never really offended me. I honestly got more offended a little bit by Jewish jokes, even though I was still struggling with my identity. And the reason I think I felt like I was Jewish was I kind of struggled with how I would say what I was. So here's a quick example of what I would say. I would say, I'm Messianic Jewish, but without the Jewish. And then you can say the story of Ruth about that being my dad coming into the movement. Confusing, right? Yeah, definitely. To put it into other words, let me give this analogy. I basically was like, I'm a cheeseburger, but without the cheese. What I was struggling to say was, basically, I was a hamburger, which basically means I had to say the word Gentile, which was a word I didn't like. I actually didn't like it, actually got kind of used to it, and then I was reading Matthew, and then Yeshua is basically saying all these things that we shouldn't do, and he's like, oh yeah, that's the way of the Gentiles. Yeah, bummer. So now, also with the different faith communities, I was reminded of this story of where I went inside this church for Christmas. And this lady looks at me and she's like, why aren't you excited? It's Christmas. And I forgot the answer I gave. But I was just like, I just didn't fit in. Everywhere I looked, I just didn't fit in. And now my struggle with Judaism and fitting in, this comment is not about this is just about the term anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism is wrong. But I made this comment where I was like, with all other races, if you say mean or hurtful things, it's racism. But for Jewish people, it's anti-Semitism. I saw that they were special, they were different. And I was trying to fit in, but all I could see were the differences. And there's one person who told my parents, hey, you're confusing your child with all these different faith communities and all that. And my parents told me later on, and I thought about it, and I was like, that person was absolutely right. I was so confused with all these different faith communities. I was like, am I Messianic Jewish? Christian, what is going on? I don't even know how to say what I am. But as I began to think about it, I was like, humans see in past and present, but God sees in past, present, and future. I'm reminded of the verse in Jeremiah where it's like God said, I knew you in your mother's womb. And even later in Jeremiah 29, he has a plan for us, and he does. Now, to get into some of the personal examples and struggles that I faced, when I was at Hebrew school, at first it was kind of easy for me to get along in preschool and early on, but then I started to notice I felt kind of different. I started feeling more alone, and there were two differences that I noticed. First one was my skin color. I was the darkest one at that Hebrew school. And the second reason was I saw a bunch of Jewish people, and I was a non-Jew. And I started to feel this alone and abandoned feeling, and I put that to them being Jewish because my parents actually did a pretty good job with making me feel confident in my own skin and all that. So I started feeling alone and abandoned, and I remember one day, I go up to my parents' room, and I'm just bawling my eyes out. I felt so alone. I felt abandoned by the Jewish people. Here I am trying to fit in, and all I see is these differences. It was tough. It was hard. And I didn't realize that till later on that it wasn't because they were Jewish and I wasn't. It was because they were public school kids and I was a private school kid. They all went to school together and I didn't, and they just had more of this bond together. And I just felt alone. And I believed that first answer. I believed that first thought that made sense, but that was a lie. It's interesting because my dad always would tell me this, and I wish I applied it to my own life. But he talked to one of the rabbis, and he was like, hey, we're Messianic. Is it okay if our kids go here? And the rabbi says, do you keep a Jewish lifestyle? It was never about Jewish people, non-Jews. He just cared about our intent. When all I saw was differences, he embraced us. He brought us in. Now, after this chapter of my life closed, I was here at synagogue, Beth Emunah, and one of the families left with a bunch of friends, and another family left, and here I was at that same feeling of being alone. And I believed that answer. I believed that lie again, that it's because they were Jewish, and I wasn't. And there's actually two fallacies in this. First one is kind of funny. About half a Messianic synagogue are non-Jews. So I'm here misguided and mad at the wrong people. Funny, right? The other one is, just as it might have been uncomfortable and difficult for me to talk to you guys, it might have been uncomfortable for you guys to talk to me. I'm reminded of this one person. He actually used to work here, do live stream and help out. His name was Alec. He heard about this and he came to me. And he's like, I'm sorry. I should have reached out more. And I'm reminded of that because I now believe that if anyone and any person in this congregation heard and knew what Alec knew, they would have responded in the exact same way. Now, after I worked through all this and that kind of chapter closed, I always felt like God was kind of using different Jewish people in my life to kind of bring me back here. You know, I went to LA Fitness, and it seemed like every person I talked to was Jewish or Israeli, or actually went to Valley Torah. And one night, I kind of stayed up the whole night with one of my friends, and I make the decision to go to synagogue that day, and my mom's kind of like, you should sleep, you were up all night. But I was like, I just got this feeling to go in that day. And surprisingly enough, our Messianic teacher, Dima, gives a sermon about Josiah. Wow. And the other person he talked about, I didn't say my friend's name, But that friend that I hung out with, that he spoke about, his name was Jacob. Funny, right? But it came to this culmination point about a year ago. I was at my school at the time at Pierce, and I see this Orthodox Jewish man. And he was religiously observant, and we have this conversation. First, we found common ground, and we were talking and all that. And I could get into the conversation, but I think the conversation was more important and crucial for me than it was for him. And as I finish up the conversation and I start driving, and I'm thinking about this whole event and talking with this Jewish man. And I feel this connection. Something about it just stood out. And I don't know whether it was because I was actually struggling with my own doubts, and I was actually talking about Yeshua to him, and I'm struggling with my own doubts. Ironic. But as I began to keep on thinking about it, I saw this block where he was literally one page away from seeing the truth, to seeing the truth about Yeshua. And I saw a little bit of myself where I was always trying to rationally view God and try to make it make sense. And I felt saddened, and as I began to think about this more and more, I started tearing up. Tears just rolled down my eyes, and as I began to think and think and think, there's this image that kind of came to my head. It was this picture of Rav Shaul, the Apostle Paul. And as we know, the Apostle Paul, he was a Jewish man who would go out, start synagogues, but he primarily also would help out the Gentiles, non-Jews. And I started to make this connection where it's like almost like God gave me this choice. He was like, here, you're a Gentile, and all those pain and struggle that you felt going through Hebrew school, going through the Messianic synagogue, that was not for nothing. Here you are, a Gentile that could go out and help Jewish people. You know, sometimes I think about this, and I wish that I could go back and stop all the pain, stop all the struggle. But God used that for good. And honestly, I would not take that back. What I would do is, if I could go back, just give that kid a hug. And know that God has a plan for him. That he really does have something in that all this pain, all this struggle ain't for nothing. It's for something even greater. To close, I kind of want to talk about this. You know, the verse John 8:30, 31 or 32, it says the truth sets us free. I think that lies do the opposite. They imprison us. They make us feel angry. They kind of trap us. In my case, they misguided me, caused me to just be more angry, more resentful. And I encourage you guys, when you are alone in these struggles, talk to God. Talk to people around you. God has put people in our lives for a reason. And we need to go talk to them and work through our struggle, work through our differences. Honestly, I should have realized that it wasn't about where I was. My identity was in God, and I should trust God to put me in wherever he has me. And you know, God, he does have a plan. His ways are higher than our own. And when we fully believe that, those lies, they kind of begin to melt away. That truth begins to set us free. And it really shows us that there is really true freedom when we follow God, listen to him, and know that his ways are better than our own. Shabbat Shalom.